everyone, and welcome to Gaming Mechanics, a podcast seeking to explore the unexplored topics of games, how they work, and why we love them. I'm Mark,
Hello.
with your
Sorry.
co-host Greg.
I was early. I'm not Mark.
And that is a very eager co-host, Greg.
That's my
And that's a jump scare,
confused,
actually. That's what that was.
confused co-host Greg.
Totally unexpected. But today we are going to be talking about the role of expectations and fear in horror games, specifically.
Yay. It's October!
It's October, yeah. This is going to be like a
Spooky
series
October.
we're doing on horror games. It's going to be 4 weeks during all of October. We're going to be covering different aspects of horror games. So today we just start with the really basic, like expectations and jump scares and how all that relates to the experience of playing a game.
We're going to set your expectations for the month.
That's right.
Also,
yes.
no, don't confuse this month, which is horror, with next month, which will be horror games. We're just doing
Oh, God.
GTA mostly for November.
Wow.
So.
Yeah, that would be. Yeah,
Re-exploring
next month is going to be.
our
It's all going to
AOE.
be Thanksgiving themed games.
Yeah, we just do that every month.
We're going to be talking about gratitude.
This
in
month
gaming.
it's March. I don't even know.
It's mustache-based games in Movember.
Oh, yeah. We
Yeah,
could do
so
that.
We're talking about. Yeah, actually, we might. But anyway, if we're going to stop brainstorming our show in front of you
I know.
and
Get to what we're talking about.
Yes. So me and Greg played an hour and a half roughly of Outlast.
I have 2 hours on Steam.
2 hours? Okay, 2 hours of Outlast. And
We did not
it
Outlast, guys.
No,
We failed Outlast.
It should have been called "Just Give Up."
Yeah, we
actually.
were outlasted.
But it was quite an eye-opening experience. And,
Oh my god, that was horrible.
We've had several discussions reflecting on the experience of playing the game. One right after, which you can see if you go to the stream is honestly pretty choppy, and there are certain things about it that didn't turn out quite right. But the footage, the live footage of us playing Outlast is on Twitch. It's in the Gaming Mechanics highlights. If you go to Gaming Mechanics or twitch.tv/Gaming Mechanics, you can find that there. But we're going to repeat a lot of the things from that discussion here. So
Yeah, we'll be doing this assuming that you didn't watch the stream.
right.
But yeah, if you want to see us unreasonably scared, and well, particularly me, Mark was a friggin' robot about this. I was actually shocked. I've played horror games. Mark hasn't done any of that, and he took it way better than I did.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised at how I was like, I just kept going to the next thing.
It was a lot of fun. It was also one of the, like, I honestly mean this, like, it was one of the most distressing. I just don't do scary stuff in general, and it was one of the worst things I've ever sat down in terms of like things that I was supposed to be doing for enjoyment or like media. That was like the worst thing I've ever done, like, hands down. Which we'll get into, but.
We still only spent another minute here on our post gaming thoughts here, but
Sure.
I actually found myself later on like wanting to go like continue playing the game and like
I did too, actually.
like wanting to advance the story and figure out like, okay, so like what am I doing? Like what's gonna happen down there? And there's like these two shady characters. There's the really big dude and there's the lanky dude with the bat, and like they clearly are kind of running things in the asylum, but like they didn't kill you, and just like trying to figure out
where his apostle. There's all these religious overtones and.
Right. Yeah. So I was like curious about like where's all this going, but I didn't actually go back and play it.
Yeah. Well, right. See, that's the thing. That's we're able to do that now. When we were playing, we didn't give a shit about who those guys were. We didn't give a damn about the plot. I just read things to make myself feel better.
I know.
Be
That
honest.
was funny.
I didn't give a damn about the actual lore. I was looking for something to break up the experience of abject horror. But so hopefully, like I said, this month we're gonna probably keep on playing some spooky stuff, and we'll talk about fear and horror games specifically. But this week we're gonna just get started by we're talking about, you know, there's a lot of different aspects that go into a game, particularly horror, and this one we kind of dialed in on a few things, particularly the role that expectation plays in your experience of fear, and this has come from both playing Outlast. I also I've talked about it on the show, I think even last week, but I saw Stephen King's It in theaters, which was like a big deal for me because again, I don't really do scary stuff. I've just like gotten into it, and I actually saw the movie twice and had some really interesting comparisons between seeing it the first and second time. They were just night and day different experiences for me. So expectation seems to be like pretty much the core bedrock of what fear is founded on, actually. Um, and as we were talking, we kind of came across there's actually two different types of expectation in fear, and particularly in horror games, that is kind of confusing in that one of them you want a lot of to scare your player, and the other one you actually don't want much of. So do you want to talk about that for a sec, Mark?
Yeah, yeah. So there's really general expectation, like this is a scary game. Okay, you definitely want to communicate that to your players. If you know have if your menu looks like something out of Viva La Piñata, then you're not going to.
I don't know that game, but I know exactly what you mean. So that's
Yeah, it's a very colorful, happy game, and
yeah,
or Yoshi's Epic Yarn or something, or Kirby's
yeah,
Epic
yeah.
Yarn, Yoshi's Woolly World.
Oh my god, look at this! This is the jolliest game of all time. You know?
So if your opening screen looks like that, like you are failing as a horror game to prepare the player to be scared. And
Right,
I'll in a minute I'll talk more sort of neurologically what's happening there. But you do want people to be like prepared to get scared
yeah,
in a way that actually enhances the scariness, which
right,
sounds counterintuitive, right? But you don't want them to have really specific expectations. Like you don't want the player to say, "Oh, I was expecting that." Right?
right.
That's a different type of expectation, and you don't want them to know exactly when this person's going to pop out. You don't want them to know exactly when which door to open in order to avoid having that thing pop out of you. Um,
Exactly.
so there's two different types of the expectations. One is specific, and one is much more general and leaves a lot more unknown.
And it's all about that, right? It's all about unknown. It was really interesting to me when we were talking about this and we were talking about expectation, and eventually we were using the same word, but I was talking about one that you need a lot of and one that you didn't need a lot of. And yeah, I think that key between the general overarching expectation that, hey, this is going to be scary, you should be scared, this game is going to try to scare you, it's going to do everything it can, it's going to take advantage of you, it's going to play into all of its own little dynamics, and it's created specifically to terrify you. Going into that and knowing that is really important, actually. If you have a game that has like zero tone of horror to it, but then has a jump scare, that's going to be scary in the moment. But then the second that's over, it's gone.
Yeah, it'll just
And
seem
that
kind
jump
of like
scare won't. And
strange.
exactly, and it's more surprising than scary, right? It's more startling than actually like unsettling, right? If you watch the playthrough with Mark and I, it's not just the jump scares where we're a mess. Like the worst, some of the worst parts are the in between,
Right.
where I'm literally paralyzed at one point. I just don't move from this room. Mark, you said you had a moment where you were just like, I don't want to do, like, I need to stop, like, I don't want to do this anymore. And
Yeah.
neither of those moments were one of those huge jump scare, like really intense moments. It was the interim. So that like general expectation that things are going to be bad is actually really really important.
Right.
And games Outlast does a fantastic job at cultivating that from the very very get go. Now the other thing which I discovered in watching it twice was the first time I watched the movie had the same thing. I knew it was just a classic horror film, had a friggin' dancing clown in it, and it was going to be just terrifying, and it was. The second time I'd seen it and understood it, and I remembered it, and saw it within a week of each other, and the fear was entirely gone, 100% gone. I was able to, like, I watched through my fingers the first time. I hid through most of it. The second time I just watched entirely straight, didn't hide, didn't jump, because I knew exactly the timing of everything, and that in of itself stole all the power. So you don't want that specific side of it.
Right.
Uh,
The side
and
where you're
like
able
you
to
said,
predict what's going to happen.
exactly. So is even like we said in terms of like the door, like in games, like in movies, they're linear, right? They can only go one way, and you're out of control. We'll talk about this more another time because this is really specific to games, and I talk about this on the stream a little bit. It is playing a scary game is just magnitudes worse than watching a scary movie for me, just
Yeah, I agree.
flat out. Um, and part of that is because you have control, right? But it's also interesting in that you don't know. You have so many options in the game. They're not linear, right? When we're going down that hallway, and I have to check 4 doors, and any one of those could be the scary door, but I don't know which one it's going to be.
Hmm.
And that moment when I open the one and it's not it, and then I go, shoot, I have to do this again. Like that's the worst.
Right.
So that not knowing which door it's going to be is really really important. And it just keeps on kind of, actually this is a term that it uses in the movie It, which is kind of weird, but it just the reason it scares people in the movie is because fear is akin to like marinating or salting the meat, it says. And that's kind of what happens with atmosphere and expectation is you are getting primed basically for the scares
Hmm.
that are coming. And if you're expecting them in a general way, then they're going to be worse when they hit. And and yeah, do you want to talk about like neurologically what's happening there, Mark?
Yeah, for sure. So when you're in an environment that is becoming more and more scary, um, the part of your brain that's responsible for fear and reactivity and being alert and all of that, of course, goes into higher gear, right?
Keeping
You're
you
more
alive.
aware of everything. Yeah, you're like trying to make sure that you're watching your step and you know what's going on around you. Well,
Right.
that is in direct competition in terms of like what gets the focus with the part of the brain that does things like critical reasoning, self emotional control, all these sort of self-regulating things, relaxation,
Mm-hmm.
arousal, all that stuff, like sexual arousal, all that stuff goes away when you're fighting for your life, basically, or like in an environment where you need to be on edge. And
Right.
so, if you create this atmosphere of fear, atmosphere, um, you turn all that stuff, you turn down the volume on emotional regulation. And so when you do present the player with something, abrupt and scary, that fear hits harder for the player or for the
Yeah.
viewer in a horror movie. Horror movies do this
Yeah.
too, where
Yeah.
you slowly ramp up the fear with the music and with the ambiance and the creaking and
Mm-hmm.
the tea kettles, and then you hit them with something.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that was actually another thing I got from my second when I saw it twice. The second time was that because I wasn't scared anymore, I was able to kind of watch analytically from like a more artistic perspective of like how, okay, like how do you structure, how are these shots put together, how is the cinematographer and the director building using the medium of film and all the tools to begin building these. And I got to watch that a little bit more separate. I wasn't like in it, right? I was like kind of outside of it, getting to watch how they were doing it to other people. And that's exactly it. Like in, I mean, again, it's different in games and horror, or in and movies because of just obviously the mediums. But like in the movie, it's tons of music, sound cues are huge. Obviously the general tone, the shift, like the one of the best sequences and the scariest is it ends with a jump scare, but the build up to it is terrifying in and of itself. It's a scene. I don't know if you've seen the trailers, but basically the kids are looking through old pictures on a projector, like in the garage,
Hmm.
and they're using it to actually map out all where all the attacks happened in the town where all the kids have gone missing, and they're figuring out that there's this one central location where this thing probably lives. And as they're doing this, eventually the projector starts moving by itself, and it begins showing family pictures. And there's one picture where like the one of the boys' mother's hair is like obscuring her face, and it keeps on going and it keeps on speeding up and it gets faster and the music is playing and the kid, you're watching the kid, you're taking cues from the kids as they're getting slight. It's very very slow. They're getting like, what's happening, like is this broken? And then you begin to see the as it goes really fast and basically becomes like a really slow stop motion video on the wall. His mom's hair blows in front of her face and then blows back, and it's Pennywise the clown,
Oh no.
the demon clown, and it's horrifying, right? But it's not jump scare yet, right? It's not huge. It's this ramping up as like, and what's happening too. You like know that this is going to be horrible the second this starts happening,
Right.
right? That like once this projector is going out of control, this is going to be horrible,
Hmm.
and it just keeps on getting more and more horrible. It does. It keeps on ramping, and you see his face, and they freak out and they kick it on the ground, and so it falls on its side and it's projecting up onto the wall still, and it slows down so that it brings the intensity down for a second, and it flashes one picture and he's still there, and then it turns off and flashes another one and he's still there, and he's a little bit closer, and then it flashes again, and he's bigger, and this is like slow, you know, like step by step. And then the last one, it flashes, and he's not there anymore, and it holds, and then bam, he actually comes out of the
Oh
wall,
my god.
and is real and 3D and giant,
Oh,
and
jeez, dude.
and then the rest of the sequence is brilliantly shot in. Like as if the camera were the projector, so it keeps on flashing in and out. So you just keep on getting these like 2 second shots of what's happening, and then it clips black, and then it comes back again, until they finally pull the garage door back up and sunlight comes in and it disappears. And that was the scene that my roommate legitimately screamed his head off at. I think it got the biggest scream of the whole movie. Like I said, that was one where it was clear that this was going to be a horrible circumstance. The second that the stupid thing started going, right? Like, no, just run screaming. That was actually another thing, that characters in horror movies are like borderline sociopaths. Like, it's not like, it's supposed to be like bravery, right? Like, right after that scene, one of the kids who's like freaking 11 years old is like, all right, we know where it is, let's go freaking kill it.
Yeah, right.
Let's go right to its house right now. Like, no, seriously, and that's what they do, and they go and I was, are you, like, no, okay, I'm sorry, like, no one would do that. That's, like, not bravery, that's, like, complete lack of self-preservation.
Exactly.
Like, something is wrong here. And similar, like, with Outlast, when at the very opening scene,
Oh yeah.
Outlast does a great job of setting expectation. The very opening scene, you're driving up you don't have any control, you can look around, and you're driving up to the asylum, and it's horrible. It's like no one in their right mind would ever get out of the car.
Yeah, let me.
Much less begin walking towards it and problem solving because the gate's locked and like skimming. Oh my god!
Going
You
up
see
the
people
scaffolding to try to sneak in a window so you can crawl through the air ducts. Like,
no one would do that.
you wouldn't do that in a normal building. Like,
Exactly,
let alone
right? Like, yeah, if I had
abandoned
to,
asylum.
I wouldn't. I know. It's just like, and like you see at the very beginning of the playthrough, you see someone move in the window. Like, you know someone's in there. And it's supposed to be it's just like ludicrous. Like, bravery is not the right word. Like I said,
No.
it's something resembling like psychopathy.
Well, going back to the scene
Anyway,
you
sorry.
described.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
was-
But I do want to highlight something in the scene you described.
please
of
do.
It. I think the loss of control is very important there, right? Because
Totally. No, it's a great point.
once your rational brain can no longer make sense of what's happening, well, guess where control shifts to? The
Right.
part of your brain that just reacts, right? Because you can't control something, the only thing you can do is react to it.
All the way down to the brainstem.
And that's again just turning off the parts of your brain that keep you from being afraid or overwhelmed by emotion, systematically getting you ready to scream.
Yeah, it's telling you this is going to be bad, 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 and you begin believing it, and it's going to get worse and worse. And yeah, when he finally does pop out of the wall, if they'd just been watching that and they found it, and then suddenly he popped out of the wall, it would have been more startling in some ways. Not even, actually. I was still startled. But it wouldn't. The fear wouldn't have lingered. It wouldn't have been fear. It would have just been a jolt, basically.
Right.
That scene induces intense fear.
A really creepy Kool-Aid man.
Yeah. That it's not really fear at that point, and that scene was so well done in terms of the speed of the build, and then the payoff too is really important too. If nothing had happened, it would have kind of let you down almost. Like, you would have been like, oh. Like, I guess I didn't have to be scared. This was kind of whatever. Nothing really happened.
It's funny, I mentioned the Kool-Aid man tongue-in-cheek, but I actually think it really highlights our points. Like, if you think about in a commercial, the classic commercials where the Kool-Aid man busts through a wall, like, a very similar thing is happening here. But the expectation set for a Kool-Aid commercial is like that it's fun and people are having fun and like, oh my gosh, the Kool-Aid man's here and he's going to provide us with sugary drinks.
Right. Yeah.
Like, so even though he busts through a wall unexpectedly, like, it's
right, exactly.
not scary.
It's not scary.
You're not scared
That's
of
a
the
good
Kool-Aid
point.
man.
Yeah, I mean, they do that. That gets played off all the time in comedy, right? Like slapstick, when the unexpected happens. It doesn't have to be scary.
Right.
It can even be jarring, right? And it can be really, really funny. Just being shocked or surprised by something does not necessitate fear. Fear has to be built and like earned. And that's that first kind of expectation that we were talking about. That, like, no, this is going to be scary. This is bad. That type of expectation seems hugely, hugely important to actually get the most out of your scares.
Do you want to talk about like the ways that talk more about the ways that Outlast builds up that expectation?
Yes, I can do that. So we were already mentioning the beginning, right? Just even before that, right? Just some really simple stuff that just is priming you. Well, even before you load up the game, trailers, right?
Yeah.
Trailers and just the images on Steam, like in the background of the page before you press play, right, are grotesque. I watched the trailer; it's horrible. You know, it shows a very very clear. It introduces the mechanic. One of the main mechanics in the game is night vision that you only have a limited amount of. So a lot of the game is too dark, and you have a camcorder, and you have night vision on the camcorder, but it takes up battery life, and so you have to manage your battery life, and you can scavenge for batteries. And so the game, remember the trailer introduces that mechanic and shows you that, and shows the consequences of not having your night vision. So my expectation, I remember I wrote them down. Let's see here. I said, going into it, I was like, so I knew that this game had a reputation for being one of the scariest games of the past decade, that it was particularly ruthless, that it's going to use all of its abilities to take advantage of me, that it's going to be designed specifically to scare me, and that was my expectation going in. So the trailer does that. The music on the main menu obviously does that. The font, right? The bizarre flashing background of the main menu.
Right.
The primer
Even
that
the
goes in.
contrast screen, we talked about that, right? Where it has you set.
It was horrifying. Where you set gamma. You set the gamma by keeping this ghoulish figure in a hallway and a doorway. You get it to just barely visible.
Right.
So even the image that you're setting the gamma on is scary as
So
F.
like already you're starting to think like, okay, at some point I'm gonna see like a character who's just barely visible, like, and he's gonna come at me.
Yeah.
Like that's what I'm thinking. Is like, how many?
Yeah, totally.
Literally setting up how visible that these creepers are gonna be that are gonna be in this asylum coming at me.
Exactly. Like I'm literally setting up my own demise right now, and that's the expectation part. It's not like people talk about fear of the unknown a lot, and that's definitely true, but it's not entirely true. It's like fear of the partly known
Hmm.
is the worst. Fear of the complete unknown is just alien, and that's just confusing, and that's a different level. But if you have it, like the problem was I didn't know any specifics about the game, so in my mind it just could blow up to this fantasy of this game is going to be horrifying, and it was telling me it was going to over and
Right.
over, and I was buying it. So even before I pressed play, my heart rate was already up, right? I was already in this state. Um, and then yeah, like we talked about that initial drive, right? Just the imagery, the sound design in that game is fantastic. That's a huge part of it. Wearing headphones is the worst experience in the world. Um, and you want to talk about some of the like mechanics of the game that did that?
Yeah. Well, this really this really hit home for me when
Yeah.
I was about to walk down a hallway and a helpful little tooltip popped up that said I can hit Q while running to look behind me. I
It's
was
like
like,
it's just one step removed from like you can press Q to see what's about to kill you like
exactly.
right now.
Uh,
Time to get
yeah,
chased.
right? Like, why would I ever need to look
Yeah.
behind me while running?
I
First of
know.
all, if I'm
Like
running from
thanks.
something, I
No
probably
point.
don't want to really take a good look at it. But also, like, I don't want to know that. I don't want you to add that mechanic.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
Like,
I've also never. Yeah, I don't want this to be necessary. I've never seen a mechanic in a game. I did actually use it at the very end when I was
did you?
getting chased to check where he was. I did.
That
Yeah,
would have maybe
it was
would have helped
horrid.
me survive. But eventually, me and Greg both died around the same part, and called it quits. But there was that. There was something. Oh yeah, the numerous times it told you just hide, don't fight. Like when you're in the security room, you check the security cameras, and the generator goes out, and you go hide in a locker, and it just there's a little thing that says like hide, like don't try to face this guy. Which it actually would be kind of interesting to know what would have happened if I would have popped out, but it would not have gone well, I'm sure.
Right. So that's an interesting example actually, because that actually begins getting into the realm of like spoiling. It's telling you, hey, this guy's gonna come attack you. It's not necessarily priming you for that attack. It's saying, hey, you're about to get attacked. So like, imagine if that hadn't happened and suddenly you just heard the pounding on the door behind
Yeah,
you. You would have flipped out. I don't. You probably wouldn't have thought to hide, and you would have just
right,
died.
exactly.
Um, And that's the other thing we kind of talked a little bit about, like, neurologically the amygdala getting activated, kind of the really heavy fear sensations, your prefrontal cortex becoming far less active as you're kind of devolving a little bit into your natural survival mechanisms. And one of the things, and it's very true if you watch, there's very, very simple puzzles in this game, like real simple. I don't even know if I could
Right.
call them
Like
puzzles, just like how to
open two
progress.
doors that are in front
Literally,
of, like, open a
literally,
door, turn on a switch. Open another door, turn on another switch.
yeah.
Like,
I know, and I like couldn't. I had a hard time doing that actually, uh, and I did it eventually. But like, if I go back and look at just like, okay, if I was just in my right mind and I had this set of constraints on a problem and how to solve it, it would be just instant, or any other
right.
game, right?
It
Like
would be
infinitely more
insultingly
complex.
easy. It would be like, this is just busy
Yeah,
work. Like,
exactly.
why
Oh,
am I
totally.
doing this?
Exactly. I'm not even doing this. But in a horror game, you don't. I wonder. We were talking about this. I wonder if they actually have to dumb down the game a little bit in terms of the mechanics, because you aren't thinking. Like, you don't have the ability to reason
Right.
properly.
Yeah.
You don't have the ability to think critically. When it's doing its job well. Like I said, I was like paralyzed at one point. I was so scared to move forward, and it was really simple. I had like two directions I could go. I'd already gone one direction, and I just didn't go the other
Right.
direction.
And
I
and like,
didn't, because I didn't think of it, and I didn't, and that was it.
yeah, you aren't going to be able to. I mean, even you were like asking me about different, because I was a little bit ahead of
Well,
you
yeah, I
in the
know. I
game,
actually ended up
but
guessing you to tell me.
even think a lot of things you asked me, I just didn't know the answer to, because I was like, I don't know. Like, I
You
was
don't
like
remember?
not as mentally aware. I was, because I was
Totally.
like, Greg, I was about as aware as you were in that moment, because you asked me like, what did the guy say?
Yeah.
In some horrible moment where he like popped out and threw us off the
Oh
edge, and I
yeah,
was like,
yeah.
I have
When he
no
grabs you.
idea.
Yeah, I told you. I was watching it when that happened to you. You scream, and I'm already scared, and then you scare me by screaming, and I go, "Don't do that!" And you're like, "I can't not do that!" Like as if you have any
Right.
control. Like this is so funny. Stop being scared. Like, this is the point, you idiot.
Exactly.
And I think it's really telling too that in my fear, my defense to that was to try to figure out. If you watch my rambling and babbling, um, a lot of it is trying to get those specific expectations, the ones that you don't want as much, because it makes it less scary. I would try to figure out what was about to happen or who was going to be bad, and then eventually I just asked Mark if, like, hey, is this guy
Right.
jump at you? And fortunately, he didn't tell me,
Yeah. No. Ruin all the fun.
because that would have ruined it. But like that was. I think that's a good adds to our case that the expectation thing is really important, and knowing specifics is really not good to fear, because that's exactly just naturally. And again, I wasn't like thinking about any of this, right? I was just naturally trying to do what I could to assuage
Right.
terror, and that took the form of trying to figure out what was going to happen. So,
I like what you said
ugh,
about how you need to know something. You can't know nothing about like the expectation. You
yeah,
can't have no expectation. Like, people always cite H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu as a fantastic example of
hmm,
alien horror, and it is. But
right,
it's not so
right. The other
alien that
world
you
version,
can't understand that it's terrifying. Like, you
ironically,
can't. It's
exactly,
not like, I don't even know how to make. It's not like other dimensional. Like, although I do understand it's a trans-dimensional being, but like, you can't.
right,
You can't make it so that it's just completely unintelligible. Like, otherwise, it's not scary.
exactly. You
It's
can't.
just weird.
There's another great example from It. Actually, it's a slight spoiler for the book. If you care about spoilers, there's a slight spoiler here in which its true form, it's a shapeshifter, right? The creature that scares the kids, and it takes on their worst fears. Basically, it was a boggart from Harry Potter before J.K. Rowling came up with boggarts, um, and it does have like a true form, but it isn't. Like it is also kind of this trans-dimensional Lovecraftian
Hmm.
horror, basically. And they describe it when the adults. There's going to be a second. The book's actually split into two parts, where it tells the story of them as kids, and then it jumps forward 27 years to them as adults and coming back to their hometown, and they've repressed all the memories of what happened as children, but the killings start again, and they sworn an oath that if that started again, they would come back and they confront it again. And so as adults, at the end, they finally get to see it in its lair and its true form, and it talks about that they perceive it, the humans can only kind of perceive it as basically a
Hmm.
giant spider-esque thing, but that's not really its true form. That it's the best that humans can do with making sense of this horrible other thing. So even in that, Steve, you're exactly right. Like if they just wrote that it was just this unfathomable thing that just broke your mind, then that's like, I don't know. I guess that's scary, and that sounds, that will won't evoke much fear actually if you're reading about it. It's something to be
Right.
avoided, but it won't like be terrifying. The fact that Stephen King recognizes that and was like, no, we're not gonna make it just. It technically says its true form are these like orange orbs, these lights
Hmm.
they call dead lights that are very difficult to describe. Right? It's like not scary. Um, so we interpret that as this huge spider, and spiders are horrifying.
Right. It makes me think of like black holes. Like, I mean, black holes are definitely dangerous, and we don't understand a lot about them.
Yeah,
But I also
yeah,
just really
that's a
don't
good point.
expect to
Yeah,
encounter a black hole in my life. So it's I don't lay awake at night
exactly.
thinking
Yeah,
about them.
yeah. No, totally. And those aren't used too often in in horror as a trope, right? Because it's not something that's gonna it's relatable, or I mean that's the big reason why Pennywise is the clown is so scary, right? Is that he's real. It's a clown. It's real. It's relatable. It's grounded. It's everything that's wrong with
With the circus,
society.
yes.
You know. Right. Yeah. Exactly. Because it is so relatable, and that's more just kind of scary things in general. But and similarly, right? Like I don't know, like the Asylum does a decent job at that in terms of those kinds of asylums don't
Hmm.
really exist anymore. Uh, but we all have been in the hospital. We've all been in, like, a medical facility, or been in a old building, and it plays off those tropes really really well. Um, and the design and the feel of the place doesn't feel horribly outlandish.
No.
There's
Other than
reality
the
to it.
name.
There's
The
groundedness
name
to
was
it.
horribly outlandish.
Oh yeah,
Mount
Mountain
Massive
Massive.
Asylum, which they frequently referred to as just Mount
I don't know.
Massive, which really was the only thing that made
Yeah,
that better.
this sounds weirdly sexual. I don't know why. It sounds like a,
Uh,
yeah. I don't know.
well, speaking of Outlast, I wanted to bring up also how the music plays an important role in that it matches the tension building, and it's also responsible for the tension building. So there's some circular relationship there, but to prepare you for a jump scare. Not prepare in the like predictive way, but prepare in the like setting expectations way. The music is going to get worse. It's going to ramp up. It's going to get more grating as you walk towards some horrible moment in the game, and that will prepare you and sort of signal to you, get ready to get scared. Similarly to how you explained the scene unfolding in It, where the projector keeps moving faster and terrible things are happening. It's sort of like that, but just auditorily.
Yeah, and that was so huge. Like if you watch the playthrough again, actually, the thing I do most to soothe myself outside of asking Mark is I just keep on
Yeah.
turning down my volume in the game, like a coward. But it was so, particularly the moment, the biggest moment that I scream, actually. I scream multiple times, but the worst one for me, the one actually throw my headphones off of my head reactionarily, was the audio, more so than
Right.
the visual. Um, and that was another brilliant little thing that the game did, and I knew it was going to do this. So there's another. We talked about like using all the tools that a game has to terrify you, and just the unique first person aspect of most horror games. The fact that as you're exploring the asylum before anything happens, really, there's one minor jump scare with the TV, but it's just a loud noise and the TV staticky, and I was so primed already, it just scared the crap out of me. But the first kind of real scare happens. You are uh, before the scare, you're learning just how to traverse the environment, right? It teaches you how to climb up things and to crouch, and how to you can wiggle between things, right? So if there's a narrow opening, then you will slow down. You can go into it, and your movement will slow down, and the camera will turn as if you have to turn your body and face, and you are right up next to the thing you're wiggling by, right? And then you turn back, and you have normal control. And the first time you do that, nothing happens. You shift through a little cabinet or something, and The second time you do that, which now like it's already bred familiarity, right? You've already done it once. It's a mechanic. You feel like you're in control. You feel kind of powerful to an extent. Like I understand how to do this. I've done it before. It was okay. The second time you do that, the camera turns, and then that's where the scare happens. There's this horrible
Yeah,
figure that appears and grabs you right in your face, and it says something.
and
That was when
nobody
I asked
knows what
Mark
it
what he
said
said.
because
God no, because we're just screaming. But the voice, like I said, the image is disturbing. It's this horribly disfigured man who grabs you, and it's so sudden and it's so close and intimate, and you feel betrayed because you
right,
thought you were doing something correct. Um, but the sound of his voice was just, oh my god, it was horrible. Uh, and and it really did help to turn down the volume. Seriously,
right,
just even the ambient noises. I think this is something else we talked about a little bit, and just the way that your visual system works, and just your sensory systems. When you are one, this happens when you're scared. Everything gets narrowed, right? You become you take in less information. You take in more specific information. Like your vision sharpens basically when you're scared. You take in less from information from your peripheral surroundings. Um, but you are very very focused on the things you're looking at. Same thing with auditory stuff. You tune out white noise, but certain sounds that evolutionarily we've deemed dangerous come on, harder and quicker. Um, and so it's the same thing. Like outside of just neurologically, when you're priming yourself to be scared, your senses are getting like I was just sitting in my chair in my room, and I wasn't like in like my face wasn't my computer probably only made up like I don't know 25% of my visual field. But for those moments, I was so focused on it, I had no awareness of anything else in the world. And same thing with my headphones. When that was loud
right.
enough, I had no other audio at all. It was just the asylum, and that illusion. That's one really beautiful thing that games can do to suck you in um, to things. Like probably if I'd watched that scene in a movie, it wouldn't quite have been as horrid. Um, but with something about just having the lights off, having the headphones on, having all of my sensory input just limited to this one thing, along with the induced fear of just sharpening, I lost.
Yeah,
That was reality to me, right? It wasn't just I
right.
wasn't in my room
Yeah,
anymore.
I would say
I
that's
was in the
one
asylum.
massive thing that, massive. That's one thing that well, fear games have going for them that you might not appreciate until you really sit down and play one. Which is, even though it's just happening on a screen in front of you, you're right. When you start to stimulate the fear and the horror elements start to really come through, you are really focusing on what's happening on that screen because you're trying to react and control what's going on around you. And of course, the game is busy ripping control away from you and making that impossible. But you do really tune out the outside world, especially if you do something like shut off the lights and wear noise canceling headphones. Then it's like forget about it.
And the difference is I've played I've kind of played two other horror games and watched a smattering of others, but the other ones I've played were Amnesia: The Dark Descent, notoriously scary, and then Dead Space, the original Dead Space, which is fantastic. And it's really true, man. I played Dead Space with my girlfriend at the time, and the difference between having the lights on and off in the room are very very difficult to
Mm-hmm.
convey how big a deal that makes. Or just playing with someone else, just being alone in my room was insane. So, do you want to talk about? There's one other aspect on Outlast I wanted to talk about, which was what happened once
Yeah,
you had a known quantity, once you knew exactly, once you knew you were getting chased, which was basically the end of our playthrough. We finally get to a point where it's not puzzly as much as there's a bad guy and it's a stealth chase scene where you have to do something with someone who wishes you harm, and just talk about how that was and how it was different,
you mentioned the
because it was
TV
different,
earlier, and I think you're right. That
right?
wasn't like a real scare, but I also thought it was really brilliant of the game designers to make that the first scare because it wasn't this huge moment, right? You don't want to like get rid of you don't want
Yeah,
to play
yeah,
your
no, it's a
ace
great
right
point.
out of in the beginning because you've got to this is a, I don't actually know how long the game is, but
Totally.
presumably it's between 5 and 15 hours of gameplay. So
It's really short, actually. We looked it up. It's 5 hours, I think.
okay, so yeah, 5 hours, but that's still a long time to try to scare somebody. So you
Oh yeah.
can't, throw everything at the player right away.
Yeah.
Um, but things do slowly ramp up as you go on, and there's a moment where you get thrown off the banister, and there's a few other scary moments. But me and Greg both realized once you are officially detected and being chased by this crazy guy with a club, it's
Right.
still scary. I mean, of course, you're trying to get away. You're trying to avoid this guy, but it isn't. You aren't getting ready to be more scared. Like
Right.
it's hard to
Right.
imagine it getting scarier than that. And so you
Right.
sort of hit this fear ceiling, and uh, in a way, like it just feels I don't, it feels less scary. There's not the expectation there anymore. You're not
Exactly.
expecting to get more scared because you're like things are already so off the rails, and I'm just trying to survive. It really can't get worse than this. Like
Right.
it could get worse than that. Like my odds of surviving could go down, but like right now it's life or death anyway. So it's like you could put more weight on the in the balance on the death side, but
Yeah.
you can't really up the stakes because it's already my life.
Right. And that's exactly. Yeah, I agree with that entirely. I mean, that was my experience of it too. Was ironically the most intense part in some ways. I was far more okay with doing. It was still very scary and really intense, but it wasn't. It was now a known quantity, right? I knew exactly what I was dealing with, and I didn't have to worry. Now, a brilliant thing to do in that case would then to be introduce something scarier, right? Like as you're running, then introduce another jump scare, and then have to like deal with that. That would be just horrible.
Right.
But at the same time, there's some level of once that like kind of fear ceiling gets hit, it's less. It really is the experience a lot less scary, and that was true in that's true in it as well. Like you said, actually, 4 hours. It's a very long. It's being scary is really hard actually. Uh, I think it's
Right.
really hard to keep up those scares. And I like what you said about the TV because it's important to ramp that. You can't blow all of your big scares at once. You actually have to start slowly. And what it does so well was that ambiance and priming you to be scared, so that something as simple as a TV couldn't get that legitimate reaction out of you.
Right.
Um, the interesting thing with, I mean, because like even with it, right? It's a long movie at 2 hours and 40 minutes, or it's 2.5 hours, I think, which is super long. But think about your average horror movie; that's like 2 hours tops,
Hmm.
and even horror movies aren't scary all the time, right? They usually have some big scare set pieces,
Right.
and so it's a really good point that's and same thing. That's one thing actually about Amnesia that is. We'll talk about that some more maybe another week. Maybe Mark and I will play some and can talk about that. But I have played that game and I both played it and watched it. And one thing about that game is that it does eventually. That's a very long game. Some of the puzzles in that game are actually very very difficult. It's more a puzzle game than a horror game in some ways. And towards the end, the fear really does wear off because you've kind of seen everything that the game has to throw at you.
Hmm.
You've gotten all of the ambience, you've gotten all the sense, you have all the mechanics. That's the other thing, right? As the game was going, we didn't know how many more things could happen, right? How many more unknown, horrible things were in this place. It's more than this one guy, you got to imagine, right? It's not like we've seen everything. And with Amnesia, after playing for like 15 hours, you get a sense of, okay, this is all this game has. And once you've acknowledged that, the monsters become a lot less scary. Um, and in a similar way to that kind of like fear ceiling getting hit. So again, it's very expectation based. Once you know exactly what to expect, the fear disappears, and that just that it's impossible to just because we're learning thinking human beings. It's possible to do something long enough and not begin to form expectations,
Right.
right? Because you actually learn in real time. So it's very very difficult just by nature for games to stay scary over a
Right.
long
You have
period
to
of time.
constantly be surprising you and not being predictable. And it's hard. It's
Right.
actually really hard to always be unpredictable.
To do that. Exactly. Oh
Um,
yeah, it's very very difficult. So I would bet if you watch like Let's Plays, even like the biggest scares probably come at the beginning.
when you were talking about like if you were running away from somebody and the known quantity existed,
Oh yeah,
and
talk
then
about this. Yeah, yeah.
and then that was upped again. I actually think, and this is totally conjecture, I don't really have any neurological explanation or hard data to back this up. But
Right.
you think about in a dream, right? Like dreams can get so scary and then you wake up. Like,
Right.
I've been killed in dreams before, but I wake up. Like, there is a limit
Right.
to how scary it can be because I wonder if this the part of your brain that's responsible for like suspension of disbelief eventually just shuts off and is like, I'm not doing this anymore. Like, the only thing that's left is just like reactiveness. And so
Yeah.
in a game, I think what would eventually happen to me if I was constantly bombarded, like if I was being chased and then somebody else and they started chasing me and then I hit like a dead end and
Right.
it's full of like creepy monsters crawling out of the walls, like eventually I would just give up in a way that would actually
Yeah. Just
take
be
me out
finished.
of the experience and then,
Yeah.
the horror would be lost because I'd be like, this is
Yeah.
ridiculous.
No, that's a good point. That's a great point. Is keeping you involved enough that you don't leave.
Right, because
Um,
in real life, like your instinct to survive is almost unlimited. Like as long as there's even
yeah.
when there
Oh
isn't a
yeah.
chance anymore, people will still fight for survival. But in
Oh
a
yeah.
game where the stakes are lower, even on a subconscious level, even if you're really bought into the game, like
Right.
eventually, yeah, you'll stop being bought in. You'll just because you have the option to check out.
And you made a great point when we were talking after the stream. I don't know if this got. I don't think I got recorded, but we were talking about this specific thing, why it got less scary when we were getting chased, which was in the talking about suspension of disbelief. That was possible up until that point, right? Like I know what it feels like to an extent to be in an old home, right? Like I know I've been in dark places where I don't really know where I am, and it's scary, right? It's spooky.
Hmm.
I have basic understandings of scary sounds that at every point, technically, I could believe it was possible for me to put myself in those shoes, right?
Right,
Until you start getting chased and hit. Suddenly, I'm not. It's kind of one to one until that point, right? The
right,
game doesn't actually hit you,
right,
like, or you're not actually getting chased. So that's where reality breaks a little bit, and you can separate yourself out. Before that, you are literally, like I said, because you're so like both neurologically as well as just sensorily in just ingrained in the game that it is your reality for a little
right,
bit, and it's plausible that that could be right. There's nothing that's happened that's entirely without. Uh, it doesn't take you out of it, right? Because you are just hearing and seeing these things.
hmm,
Um, and the second that that changes and the stakes become, like getting hit and death, your brain doesn't go there, right? I didn't get up and start running or fend off blows.
right.
Um,
And because like there's no sensory input there. Like when the game plays a
right,
scary noise, you hear it. It's just
right,
like if there was a scary noise outside of my door right now. And
right,
if you see something horrific, it's just like if I were to open a door and see something horrific. But as soon as the game implies that I was physically struck, and that sensation, of course, does not happen,
right.
then it totally breaks the immersion in the game.
Right. What's at risk is no longer plausible to actually happen, right? Like for when you talk about expectation beforehand and or what's potential risk, which is like horrible things happening or something really scary popping out at me or a loud noise, that is completely reasonable for that to happen to me in real life,
Right.
right? That's like actually what's happening to me as a person. Once it becomes physical, that is no longer anywhere plausible that's going to happen.
Right.
Like that fear is no longer real. So I don't have to. It's a lot less stressful, ironically, right?
Right.
In a real situation, you would probably, when you're actually under assault, you kick into like full survival, fight, flight, like literally
And
fight
we
or
probably
flight.
will do an episode just talking about managing that tension because yeah, you
Yeah,
can't you don't want to not scare
overdo
the
it.
player, but you also can't you don't want to make the game appear that it's doing things that you actually can't deliver on,
Exactly,
like hitting
exactly.
you
You don't
with a
want to.
bat, like you can't. Anyway, but I don't want to get too much into that because I think we will talk about that later on.
Yeah, that's a great one because I have some thoughts about that too. There's some scenes in Heavy Rain that are uh, deal with physicality, and there's some cool ways that the game makes you feel things.
Hmm.
Actually, there's a couple scenes that are pretty brutal in terms of one of the it's kind of Saw like in terms of some of these tests that you have to do to prove your love as a father for your son, and one of them notoriously is you have to decide whether or not to cut off one of your fingers,
Ooh.
and that whole sequence is quite involved, and it's very unnerving. It's not just totally separated out. There's some cool ways that the game tricks you into thinking that you're kind of it's unpleasant. It's unpleasant. So that'd be a cool topic. I was gonna
No,
sorry.
I
Go
was
ahead.
going to ask if you want to talk about either Soma or Dead Space.
Yeah, I was gonna say let's move on. Let's talk about some other examples of these kind of the ways that expectations set. I do think that this is a pretty good generalizable theme. It's not just on Outlast. I think this is pretty true across the horror genre as well as other games. So with it was interesting. As I was thinking about this with Amnesia. Remember how I was talking about my original expectations for Outlast were this is going to be ruthless. This is going to take every advantage of me. It's going to betray my trust. It's going to take advantage of camera motion. It's going to take advantage of everything it can to terrify me. And I know that this is going to be just absolutely horrifying. When I actually had watched Amnesia. I'd watched a playthrough before I bought it and played it. So on one hand, a lot of this is a little bit moot in terms of, like I said, I had some of that specificity. I will say it'd been like 2 years since I'd watched it. I only watched it once. It was a long time ago. I kind of had a general sense. I didn't remember many specifics. So a lot of that was still intact. But one thing that was different with Amnesia was I didn't have, both because of what I'd seen of the game, but also just like the way that Amnesia presents itself is very different than Outlast. Amnesia is a game far more about building extremely slow building tension without very many actual big huge releases and scares, and we can talk about that too, like the ratio between like that release to
Right.
build kind of seems to be really important. Amnesia nails it, I think, for a long time. I think it fails a little bit in the second
Right,
half
but it is a much longer
for
game,
other
as
reasons,
you
but
mentioned.
it
So
is.
I
It
think that
is.
the management of that tension is it's more difficult, and it does have to be a bit more just stretched out.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. But what it's masterful at is this growing sense of dread and horror as you learn new things. And because you're not as horrified at every single moment, you're able to think those things through. Like I said, we weren't like horrified by what was happening in the asylum, like on a personal
Yeah,
basis, right? Like I wasn't horrified by reading these like notes and letters and like seeing. I was horrified by the direct like
right.
threats to my life.
Yeah,
And
to the
Amnesia, it's
point where
far
I didn't
more
even read the
you
documents. Like I was like, I don't care.
exactly,
Like, what's
exactly.
more terrifying,
Right.
reading about how this guy can regrow his skin, or so he had some terrible burn accident,
Right.
or actually running into his hanging corpse in the library? Like,
Exactly. No, no, it's great. Exactly. No, right. You're dead correct. Because like, yeah, the descriptions would be like telling you what had happened to make these people horrible, or you can just
right,
experience these horrible things, you know. And so amnesia is the opposite of that. You don't. It's this very slow building. That's the point of the game. You don't remember anything, and so as you progress through the game, you begin getting your memories back at what you did and what happened. And it's this very slow building, very deep seated horror of. It's a lot less visceral and it's a lot more uh, really
right.
disturbing actually. Um, as you go, and because of that, like I said, so that expectation was I wasn't in this constant state of panic like I was in Outlast. Amnesia is terrifying to play, but it's different. It's really hard to force yourself to go forward. You feel you can be a little bit more involved in the character and the world because you're not so terrified all the time, and you feel dirty about the things that you do or have done as you begin discovering your story. Um, some of the voice acting is really good. A lot of it's all kind of flashback. Um, and there's a lot less jump scary abject horror in Amnesia. So in terms of the way Amnesia handled expectations, my expectations for how scary it was going to be were a lot lower in some ways. But it was still just terrifying to play because of these really slow building environmental and the only way it does, like you said, like the only way it could do that successfully
Mm.
was by being slower. Otherwise you don't care about any of, like, I noticed things on the walls, you notice like decorations, you notice small things in the environment that are just really disturbing, and that are actually upsetting. Like I didn't notice any of that in Outlast.
Right. Yeah,
uh, I noticed the screaming man
that's a very like
jumping at me trying
specific
to strangle me.
type of horror that I think some people really appreciate. Like, it's less flashy, but there was actually a moment in Firewatch, and this will be a spoiler for anybody who's thinking about playing that game. It's not very long, so just go ahead and do that. But this will be a spoiler. You
Yeah.
find this backpack in the woods, and it's got an alarm on it, but you don't know that. So you're tracking this backpack. You find it through a transceiver that detects radio waves, and it takes you to this tree. There's a backpack on the tree. You take the backpack down, and this alarm starts going off. And you smash the alarm, and you start heading back to your lookout because, presumably you've just alerted somebody as to your whereabouts. And you're on the walkie-talkie with one of the other park rangers, and while you're walking back, you're talking about how bad it was, and she is trying to comfort you, and she's like, well, you're back home in your outlook now, your lookout, and just take it easy for the rest of the night, and you say, I'm not in my lookout, like that isn't me, and it's this moment where your brain you have to think about it. It's not super hard to put together. But like you're processing what's happening, and you're like, oh my gosh, somebody's in my lookout. Like, and then that moment is scary.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be scary if you were so freaked out that you couldn't think through what was happening.
Exactly. If you were running from someone in that moment, or if there had been something horrible when you found the backpack and it had, like this dead girl's head popped out at you and screamed, like that would be I'm picturing the scene in Nancy Drew. So incongruous with the whole rest of the game. Good lord. There's the Let's Play, mostly walking, something we talk about often on the podcast, Day 9, playing adventure games, they play Nancy Drew, and Shadow of Water's Edge, I think is the name of it. And God almighty, the whole game is boring as just hell. It's literally doing puzzle books and navigating the subway system.
Not great expectation setting up until that point, actually, I would say.
And there's oh my gosh, there's a couple kind of creepy scenes, but there's one big jump scare that is really legitimately terrifying. That you have no sense, and so obviously fear can still happen with those, and in some ways like that. Okay. So let's talk about Soma for a second. Soma's another game done by I forget the devs' names for Amnesia, but it's the same studio. And so Soma is similar in terms. Yeah. What was that? Frictional. Yep. Yeah. Maybe is it? Frictional.
Yeah, it is.
Yep. That's it. Yep. Yeah, they did Penumbra. Then. Okay, cool. So Frictional are really good at what they do. And Soma is similar to Amnesia in terms of that more slow build, and even more so, I think. Soma felt you're underwater for Soma, which is pretty cool. It's a cool environment, and that felt even more exploration-y. There's a little bit sense of wonder in the area as you were going around, more so than just abject terror.
Yeah.
Right. Soma was not too scary until the monster shows up, and then it's very scary. And part of that is the jarring switch between this peaceful, beautiful place, and then this sudden horror of having a threat nearby. So we're talking about expectation building up to kind of salt the big scare. There is some level of that jarring juxtaposition that can be really scary too. I think that one just pays off a little bit less. I think it's maybe more initially shocking, but I was way less stressed, and I wasn't playing, but just orders of magnitude less stressed watching Soma full screen with headphones, in the dark than.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I wonder if you mentioned even the ambiance of being underwater is, things just happen more slowly underwater. It does feel like just less of a terrifying environment. I don't know if that's just me or if everybody would agree with that. But
it's just less classical, right? I think we have less horror tropes to draw on for it,
Yeah, that's true. And I really appreciated that it was creative and sort of broke the mold because I'd never seen an underwater horror game.
Yeah.
But there are less tropes for it. There's kind of the abandoned pirate ship sort of thing. But even that is usually it's one that's been beached. It's been scuttled, and so it's on the ground.
Yeah, totally. So that's that, and so that can make use of more of that kind of the really unknownness that we talked about. But again, I wonder if that's a little bit less. Because let's think about I don't remember the movie Gravity. That came out in 2014, 2015. And that movie it's in large part about space. It's about Sandra Bullock as an astronaut getting caught in lost in space, kind of drifting. And I've never been in space. I can't imagine what zero gravity feels like. But there was, this shot right the first time after this big disaster, and she gets thrown off her the space station, the ISS, and it just keeps on zooming out, centered on her, until she's just this white little dot, and it just shows the vastness of space around her. And that moment is like, I can't comprehend that, but it was like deeply upsetting in the theater,
Right.
right? It was this otherness that was so extreme that I didn't want to. I didn't want it. So I think, all of these things are spectrums. I don't think any of this is necessarily absolute. Like there's the best, correct way to scare people, and
No.
different people respond to different things. But I think Soma did tap into some of that, right? There's some fear of being deep underwater and having something move in the water, and you're like, what the, yeah, you know.
I will
Even though
say
you can't imagine it.
with Outlast, there was a point where, and it was near where I stopped, because, and I'm glad it was,
Yeah,
but I was just, I was so tired.
yeah,
Like my stress and adrenaline had been running on high for the last hour,
yeah,
and I was just sort of like, I was, I just it wasn't sustainable. Like
yeah,
physically, I was like, I just don't want to. I don't want to do this anymore.
yeah.
And I think that games like Soma and Amnesia might do a little bit better job, like allowing you to continue
Evening that
playing
out.
for longer periods of time. Because Outlast, yeah, it's a 5 hour game.
Yeah,
So if someone can sit down in front of your game for 5 hours and play it all the way through, like I presumably they enjoyed the whole game, but like they
right.
didn't get really that much out of it. Like they only had it for a day and then they're
Yeah,
done.
and it's gone. Yeah,
Um, and so you kind of want the player to not sit down and do it all in one sitting, and that
totally.
actually works to your advantage as a producer of a horror game, because then all the neurological systems get reset, the
Yeah, the second you come
desensitization
back,
goes
right? Yeah,
away,
yeah.
like they get to go have their normal life where nothing bad happens, and then
Hmm.
they come here and they enter hell again,
And you foster a sense of dread because you just gave them something to be scared of. You're going to remember the fact that your first time we played sucked,
right,
and if we were to go and reboot Outlast after this, I would be
yeah, I'd
just
be
as, if not more, scared of what was about to happen because I remember my last experience was horrible.
right,
So yeah, you're right. That is a good point. Doing that. One thing I just to wrap up here, and this will be another probably podcast that we could do. Just in terms of one thing that all three of these games we've talked about, particularly the frictional games, are famous for this. But you're completely powerless. Your only option, there's no combat at all.
right, right,
Other horror-ish games that I've played, like BioShock, has horror elements for sure. I'd say that's still more. I wouldn't call that a horror game. It definitely has really strong horror elements. And then Dead Space is like just straight up horror. But both of those games have a lot of combat. Dead Space was renowned for its combat system, actually, specifically, which is fantastic. If you don't know anything about it, it's really quite brilliant. Um, but when I was thinking about the difference between these games and Dead Space, there was a talking about that continual need to keep on scaring you and how hard that is. Dead Space, that was probably like a 15, 20-hour game. It's a long game, actually.
hmm
Um, and that game continued to be stressful and terrifying. A little bit less so as it kept on going, for sure. Just naturally, like we talked about. But the way that they do that with Dead Space was they kept on introducing new things to fight. Basically, new necromorphs, new space zombies.
hmm
Is that game? You're in space, and the combat is based on actually removing limbs. You have a fusion cutter. You're an engineer, and instead of trying to like get headshots on the zombies, the way you do damage to them is removing limbs. So it's very surgical. Actually, it's really clever, pretty gory. But the way that they keep on getting new scares, they have set pieces and ambiance and all that jazz and everything we've been talking about. But the way that they keep on getting gameplay kind of yardage is by continually giving you new things to fight, and suddenly you have to figure out how to kill these things, and they are aesthetically terrifying, and they are a threat to you, and it's very combat's very quick and brutal, and they another great thing Dead Space did was I think this is semi unique for it at the time, which was every time you died, it was a unique death animation.
Hmm.
For whatever kills you, each type of enemy had a different type, long list of animations that you could do to kill you, and it would show this pretty detailed dismemberment of your character. So death actually felt definitely very desirable to avoid. Actually, uh, it wasn't just like you disappear and it has a game over screen. You have to watch this horrifying moment as
Right.
your character gets dismembered. So those are some things that because it was combat based, it gave the ability to basically give more problem solving. I think it was still terrifying, but in a different way, much more involved. And I think it was easier for them to make a longer game because of that. Right? They didn't have to just rely on. They had more mechanics to work with.
Right. I think that's probably a good place for us to leave
Yep.
this and wrap up.
Perfect.
So, I would say I think we've done a pretty good job this podcast laying out that expectation building is super important in games, and there are definitely different ways to scare people, but that the expectation of being afraid and being in a horrific environment is a key part of that. And we're not telling the horror game developers something they don't already know. That's why they include all these elements.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's just a really interesting, just kind of meditation on fear, right? A little bit
Hmm.
it really is all in your head. It's crazy. I was able to watch the same exact sensory stimuli in it and have completely different experiences,
Hmm.
um, because the fear was gone. So it doesn't really have as much power as you give it.
If I replayed the first 20 minutes of probably what it would take for me now of Outlast, like
Yeah,
it would be
yeah,
very different.
wouldn't it? Yeah, exactly. So sweet. Well, I think it was a good start. More spookiness coming.
Yeah, we're gonna have more playthroughs of more games, and it'll be good. Hopefully, we'll get the kinks in the stream worked out, and we're gonna continue covering horrific things as the month continues. So stay tuned.
Yeah, well, I hope you guys have been enjoying. As always, drop us a line. Our Twitch is twitch.tv/gaming mechanics. And until next time, I hope you guys have a spooky October.
If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter @GamingMechanics or our Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.